Hi, hi.
Hello.
Okay, so let me open up your paper here in U.S. foreign policy, and let me see if I can find it here. And and so we go to Alyssa, and there it is. So let me share the screen, share like that, and go share screen. Okay, so here's the paper. Okay, so you wrote here. Let me remind myself what I wrote, and let me save it again in case we make some more changes. And this, make it to a two there. Okay, so in terms of your English is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I just want to work in terms of helping you learn about how in academic writing, in at least from my experience in the U.S. Perspective, there are certain conventions we follow. Like one of the rules we follow is that typically we don't use first person. Like you don't say I believe or I think, because if you say I believe, I think, you're reminding the reader that he's reading opinions, and we don't want to read opinions. We want to read what you claim is the truth, and that you support the true statement with evidence in the form of source citation. You don't need to say I believe. You don't need to say I think. So
Okay.
you just make a truth claim and you support it with evidence. So so yeah, you don't think it's not the most, so the political differences are not the most important. Okay, you say not important enough, but the first thing we can point out is that you can say we can point out. You don't need to say we. You can just say the first thing to point out is that the U.S. government listens to the people. All right.
Okay.
You don't think the Chinese government listens to the people?
Not really. I think they propose an ID, and that the population has no choice but to agree with it.
Well, I mean, they do listen to public opinion. Even dictators have to respond to public opinion. Even if they don't accommodate it, they respond in different ways. They might also include use of force and coercion and fear to control it. But at the same time, they have to maintain support among some key elements of society to stay in power, even if it's just the security forces, like the police and the military, and those can involve a big section of society. And so, those police and security forces, they have economic interests, they have, personal interests. So, the Chinese the Chinese authorities are very much concerned about, they'll use, obviously they use coercion, force, and fear, but at the same time, they are very much aware that they have to provide other incentives, positive incentives, to keep the Chinese, at least the Chinese elite and their followers supportive. So, it's just a matter, for example, of the acknowledgement of how you go about doing that. For example, the Americans claim, and the liberal democratic system claims, that the results of elections that are supposed to be the final decision by the people on the judgment of our performance. And those elections have to be free and fair, whatever that means. They can't be fake elections like they have in China or the Soviet Union. But the Chinese claim that they, through their leadership of the Chinese nation and their effectiveness in delivering social justice and dignity to the Chinese working class, however that's defined, that is their justification for their political system, which typically also in those kinds of situations involves the claim of national emergency. I mean, the Chinese leadership say, for example, that first off, China was being abused for almost 200 years. And then in the 1930s, the Japanese invaded and began genocidal attacks. And the British and the French and the Germans and the Americans also have been involved in dividing and weakening China. So China, the Communist Party claims that basically it's been in a state of emergency in terms of rebuilding China and defending China against its enemies. And those enemies are still have been focused on the Soviet Union, but now the Soviet Union has been gone for 30 years. And sooner or later, somebody like Trump was going to emerge, who's going to start focusing on China in the United States. So they can come up with all sorts of justifications about why there's limits on freedom of expression, because they say that there are enemies who are looking for any way to weaken and divide China, as they did for so long, until finally China rose up and stood up under the leadership of the Communist Party against the humiliation and suffering imposed by outside imperial powers. And of course, it's a self-serving justification, right? Because they always portray a world where there's these conspiratorial threats that want to, for example, divide, keep Taiwan, and maybe recognize Taiwan as a separate country, and further divide more territory that the Chinese have already lost, add Taiwan to that. Because of what does the Chinese Communist Party say? That, and this basically supports your argument that this is a one-party state that has to justify to the public why it limits and constrains and silences them on certain topics. And it claims it's doing that because it has to make China great again.
Yeah.
And so they have to be belligerent and assertive internationally in unjustifiable ways. Well, I mean, unjustifiable to Washington and to the West, and because how they can't otherwise justify their rule and all the interests that come from their system. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party involves millions of people who have vested their careers, their identities in that, who've built careers, their livelihoods. They're not going to just say, well, we don't need the system anymore. They're never going to say that, until they're always going to portray a world that justifies their authoritarian, even totalitarian one-party state. And that means they have to be belligerent or dangerous. And so, that's the argument about why you need to contain a society like that, because the advocates of containment claim that there is a important connection between how a government treats its people and how that government acts towards the outside world. That you need to contain Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany needed to expand in order to justify its continued rule under the Nazis. And the claim was that the Soviet Union was like that it had to expand and spread its nasty political system, because it couldn't exist. It couldn't maintain its existence if it didn't. And is that true about China? And if it is true about China, then your claim is wrong, because you say it's not the most important aspect. So liberals and neoconservatives say no. I mean, it's the nature of the Chinese system. In terms of repressing certain points of view, in terms of limiting freedom of expression, they have to come up with a justification for that. They have to justify and make people, if not be enthusiastic, at least acquiesce and accommodate the way they run things, because they say they deliver. They deliver economically in terms of improving people's lives every year, and they make China great again in the world. And they have to prove it. And that's dangerous.
Yeah.
So you say the first thing we point out is the way the U.S. government reaches out to the people. You say it's not the most important aspect. The U.S. tries to reach out to their citizens by conducting surveys and analyzing the results. Even though most Americans are not interested in foreign policy, they're still in foreign policy the attentive public, which they represent 20% of the American population. There are ways how the government tries to control and how the news comes out, though, by rephrasing or less news coverage. This influences the people's thoughts. Well, let me ask you, how would you respond to a Chinese apologist who says, hey, your political system produced Donald Trump as president of the United States, as the leader of your country, this thing what became the leader of your country. How can you claim that China is the threat to world peace when, you know, somebody like Donald Trump would never become leader of the Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what would you say if you're an American apologist? You might say, well, I mean, you know, the American system worked because, look, Chinese leadership produced people like Mao Zedong, who, when he was leader of China, undertook these ridiculous policies like the Great Leap Forward that caused millions of people to die of famine. Like, we're going to industrialize now in 10 years in the 50s. It was ridiculous. We don't know how many people died from the economic dislocation. There you go, Communist Party. And then his Cultural Revolution, which completely disrupted everything and produced chaos and death. What, communist leaders are better than American leaders? So yeah, okay, the US system produced Donald Trump, but the US system stopped Donald Trump, contained Donald Trump, controlled Donald Trump, and removed Donald Trump. And you can say one of the benefits of that experience is that now, you know, more American white people are tied into the political system, that they actually pay more attention because they actually believe that somebody like them can become president. A white supremacist, male, chauvinist, nasty person, not the most intellectual, non-intellectual, talks in simple terms. Even somebody like me can become that kind of person, become leader of the US. I love America. God bless America. I'm going to fight for, you know, I mean, that was the point I made in the class, right? That if you looked at 1939 on the eve of World War II, which regime had the best way, best system, which government, which state, United States, Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, was best at mobilizing its potential resources to prepare for international conflict? What was best? And the US system was best. The German system under Hitler, I mean, there was a majority of people loved Hitler, but there was a large minority of people that despised that thing, Adolf Hitler. And they resisted, and they were not enthusiastic, and they were terrified. They kept their mouths shut because they thought they'd be killed if they opened their mouths, but they weren't enthusiasts. I mean, Germany had ridiculous problems mobilizing its resources during the war. Because, you know, there was a large, quiet, large minority that knew this was a mistake. This was horrible. And then, of course, the Soviet Union was a whole nother case because it was a multinational state. But the United States, you know, I mean, most people, not all, but most people in the United States, they accept the outcome. They believe that the outcome of policy, of politics is I almost said is just, that it's right. You see some challenging of that, like Donald Trump didn't really win legit because the Russians carried out a covert digital disinformation campaign through Twitter and Facebook to spread disinformation. And that's why Donald Trump, so Donald Trump's not really president of the United States. He's not, but that's still, now that he fades away in the past, people just kind of want to forget about him. Even those people, the people that don't like him want to kind of forget about him. And I don't think that, well, you know, he's still a dominant actor in the US. But anyway, so I guess those same points argue for your argument that really the US and China, they cooperated against the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was still around until early 1990s. Do they need a common enemy to cooperate? I mean, the United States was allied with the Soviet Union during World War II against Nazi Germany. I mean, two very different political systems. Are you saying that the United States and the United States and China, it doesn't really matter what kind of political systems they have. Sooner or later, they're going to be in conflict with each other.
Yeah, that's kind of what I see. They will only like work together, like you said, if there's like a common enemy, because they both want to win like the race of being.
And this is a controversial point because I think some neo-realists like John Mearsheimer would agree with you, and they would say that, you know, if you were to explain why were Britain and Germany becoming enemies at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, well, they would say, if you ask somebody why to explain that, who loves Britain and loves democracy, they say, well, because Germany wasn't really democracy. That was part of the problem. When in fact, Germany was pretty democratic, but people don't want to admit that because they don't want to admit that. The point is, if I'm going to be in conflict with somebody, I got to come up with reasons to explain why I'm in conflict with somebody if I'm a state. And I will come up with reasons that justify the conflict, my conflict with them. And I will say that that country really wasn't democratic. Germany, Imperial Germany in 1914 was not really democracy because they have this Kaiser, this hereditary king, and he controlled the military. And so it wasn't really, you know, a democracy. And I think John Mearsheimer would agree with you that it doesn't really matter if it does matter, but not so much that even if China had a different system, if they had a multi-party system, that inevitably the rise of China would make America hostile because there would be conflicts, and those conflicts might lead to a change in the domestic political systems, like the rise of Trump, you know, or some other, but that conflict would emerge, and the conflict would influence the internal politics of the country to make them more hostile to each other, and reinforce those conflicts. Because I'm trying to articulate what this, because this democratic peace theory that, you know, if the United States promotes democracy to promote peace, even if we have to use bombs to promote democracy, that it seems very self-serving. Like, you know, but it's still very, very popular theoretical perspective. But I think that basically, you know, if countries are in conflict with each other, which a neo-realist say inevitably there will be conflict, and countries have to justify and explain that conflict, and they will heighten the perceived threat, which will internally affect the internal politics of the country to make it move in directions which are different, that differentiate themselves from the other country. If only to inoculate or preserve themselves from threats from the other country.
Yeah.
So I don't know how far to push that, because, you know, if it's true that, you know, that domestic differences really do drive these conflicts, there's a fundamentally domestic regime differences between the United States and China, it means China, a conflict is inevitable until one or the other system changes, the American system or the Chinese system. And that would be, well, why can't the American system produced Trump? Why can't the American system change? I mean, Trump was a fascist. He was a fascist.
Yeah.
So, and he's still around. Do you think that, so do you think Biden could change Americans' minds that China's a threat?
I don't think he can change it in only 4 years. I think it's something that will take time, but maybe.
I mean, I don't think he wants to change. He's talking. I mean, he's using that perceived threat from China all the time himself now in order to get his legislation passed the U.S. Congress. That we have to do this to meet the challenge. We have China. We have to show that democracies can solve problems. He's always talking in these terms. Now you can say he talks one way, but then in private, he wants to cooperate with the Chinese. But I don't know how far that really goes. I mean, we'll see. I mean, is the new shared threat climate change? Is the new threat pandemics? Is the new common threat, climate change, new common pandemics? Is the new common threat, I mean, and what is the role of the European Union in mediating? I mean, I don't see much, at least rhetorically, the European Union acts like a friend of the United States against China. They're talking about China being a problem as well. And
yeah,
this is all very depressing. And realists are depressing. They say, yeah, that's the way human beings are. They suck. Human nature is basically pretty melancholy. People, the nature of the domestic political systems, that's secondary. It's not unimportant, but it's secondary. And particularly now that the United States has developed a vast national security bureaucracy since 1950, and those people are around and they're not going anywhere. And they are going to continue to portray a world in which the United States has to be involved everywhere. The United States interests are global, and they're not going, and they're always there, and the economic interests have emerged around them to support that developed around that worldview. And so, that's why realists are depressing. They said, you're not going to get rid of war and the threat of war in international relations. All you can do is mitigate and control it. And people are still going to kill each other. It's just going to happen.
Yeah.
They're not going to build, some beautiful future world where there's no longer conflict among human beings. It's not going to happen unless, of course, we get invaded by Mars. Then maybe. But people, they seek enemies. They're predisposed. Not everybody, but they're predisposed to look for challengers.
Yeah, I agree.
The most you could do, realists say, is you got to basically, trying to establish spheres of influence is challenging in a world where we have nuclear weapons, in which it's not really clear what your sphere of influence is, because it's not geographic anymore, because of the threat of nuclear war and the global problems we face in terms of global economic interdependence, climate independence, which is part economic interdependence. That what does it mean to establish an area of the world that belongs to the United States hegemony, that belongs to Chinese hegemony, that belongs to Russian hegemony? What does that mean? I mean, when you have a European Union that, for example, still imports most of its oil and gas from Russia, even though there's an escalating conflict between Russia and NATO over Ukraine. It's like the world becomes more complicated, and we compete more and more indirectly through technology, maybe going to space, because we all know that we can't risk a direct conflict to resolve our disputes, because we'll all die. And so who's best at managing that competition? Is it the Chinese system or the American system? And then, of course, the Chinese say, well, our system is best. We know it's best. We're never going to elect someone like Trump. And Mao Zedong was an unusual situation, because he was the response of a desperately poor, huge country that was being parceled out and divided de facto by outside powers. And China's a different place than it was in 1950. They're never going to elect a Mao Zedong. He's never going to emerge as leader of China today.
Yeah, but wasn't Trump also a reaction to a lot of uncertainty in America? Like
Yeah.
what? Yeah. Like would America ever produce a president like him again?
Yeah. I mean, that's the point, right? That if people become uncertain and they become fearful and they fall back to traditional stereotypical notions of what the problems are. The problems are the globalist, feminist, homosexual, queer, environmentalist, poor, black and brown people threatening, and Jews threatening America. And so we need to vote for Donald Trump. Then, and that's their response to uncertainty, to fall back to traditional stereotypes of self versus other. Then the Chinese would say, well, you know, we have institutional systems in place to prevent that from ever emerging. We will respond with a more technocratic response than this ridiculous Trump phenomenon in the United States. And, you know, Xi Jinping, you know, does anybody, I mean, people speculate that this guy really thinks that he's going to lead China to become the ruler, the dominant actor in the world. Is he a problem? He does eliminate his opponents, but he doesn't kill them. He does agree to, you know, put Uyghurs in concentration camps for quote unquote re-education, but he doesn't I don't, you know, I mean, what are the chances he's going to become a Chinese Hitler? I mean, in the nuclear era, when, you know, at least 50 countries can make nuclear weapons, if not more, if they wanted to.
Yeah.
So do you have any questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Not really.
Okay. All right. So I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.